Well, today, as I mentioned, is St. Francis Day, and St. Francis of Assisi is a saint of the church, like we heard, and many consider him to be one of the most venerated religious figures in Christianity. Not only was he a friar, a deacon, a founder of several religious orders, and a reformer of the church, he was a lover of animals and creation and all living things. And like many who commit themselves to religious community life, he renounced worldly goods. He lived a life of poverty. And as a lover of creation, he believed that nature itself was a mirror of God. He called all creatures his brothers and his sisters, and even preached to the birds, and supposedly persuaded a wolf to stop attacking some people if they agreed to feed it. Lots of stories about him exist. And so on his feast day, many church communities engage in worship services where there's a blessing of the animals, which we will do later outside the church doors at 1 o'clock. And all are invited to bring their pets and animals, pictures of their pets. And like I said, even those without pets are invited to enjoy the community and the prayer and the celebration of the natural world. Each dog will receive a treat and a blessing, and their human friends will have some refreshments too. It's a great time of fellowship and fun, and we give thanks to St. Francis for his life and ministry, which help us to remember that God's created order includes all creatures, and that we humans are only one part of that larger web of life. But St. Francis's life was not always one devoted to God and nature and simplicity. He was born in the late 12th century to a wealthy Italian cloth merchant father and a French mother. And his early adult life was one of pleasure and indulgence. He surrounded himself with fine clothing and rich foods, and he grew up with the privileges of a nobleman and often found himself in trouble from eating, drinking, and spending a lot of good times with his friends. A war broke out in a neighboring city, so Francis, who always longed for fame and glory, decided to join a military expedition. But he was taken captive and he fell ill, and during his incarceration, he had an opportunity to reevaluate his life. His father eventually paid his ransom, and Francis returned home, and as he was nursed back to health, he was walking outside one day and he came across a church. And he went inside the church and prayed and asked God to renew his life. And in that moment, he heard God say, "Francis, help me repair this church." And he felt that God had spoken to him and called to him. And like many of us, when we hear God's call in our lives, he was immediately light and joyful. But he also realized that he needed money in order to repair the church. So he unfortunately made the decision to steal money from his father, and his father became angry with him. And he turned to the local bishop to punish him. And the bishop told him to give back his father's money, and Francis did pledge to do so and more. He laid all of his clothes at his father's feet and pledged his life to the service of God. Now, his father didn't understand Francis's actions, but the bishop understood. And Francis picked up a cloak and received the bishop's blessing and went forth into a life of poverty and service. He sought out the poor and the sick. He rebuilt that church in which he prayed, and he preached to animals and humans alike. And living things were drawn to him, including the men who eventually, with Francis, established the Order of Franciscan Brothers. And he also helped establish the Franciscan Order of the Poor Sisters of Charity. So Francis became generous and simple and faithful and developed a passionate devotion to God and love of God and of all God's creation. And it's interesting to note that while the exact details of Francis's life may not resemble our own, his life and journey was filled with challenge and suffering and joys and ups and downs, questions and seeking and searching, maybe just like our own lives. And there were also moments of great joy and understanding and revelation like ours. And this real and gritty and honest and authentic faith life may be another reason that we resonate with him so much. He heard God's call, he turned away, and he was brought back again. We may resonate with Francis because we human beings falter, we make mistakes, but God is ever present with us, ever steady, always guiding us whether we know it or not, or always ready to let us know of that presence and guidance, whether we're ready to hear about it or not. And similarly, God is always available to us to take rest in God's spirit and grace and truth when they're made known to us. As Jesus says in today's gospel, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It may have taken St. Francis half of his life and many mistakes, but Francis eventually knew that he could rest in God, that he could take his heavy burdens and lay them down at God's feet and take God's yoke upon himself and learn from God's ways. Because God is gentle and humble, and in God's grace, he and we can rest. When the world of COVID or violence or confusion attacks our bodies and our spirits, we can turn to God and lay all of those burdens with God. The world can be overwhelming and too much for us at times. Even when we hear people say, we're only given what we can handle, we realize that no, sometimes the world can give us more than we can or want to bear. The world can suffocate us. So we can take that stuff that is too much and too heavy for us to carry and give it to God. And if you're not sure what I mean or not sure how to do it, just try. Just talk to God. You don't need to be in church or in a special location or in a special kind of mindset. Anywhere at any time. We can just turn to God in whatever way we connect with God, in conversation, meditation, in singing, in exercising. We can ask God to take what we cannot handle. And doing so can be liberating, because we may realize just how much room burdens can take up in our lives and in our minds and in our hearts. And giving them to God can lighten our load so that we can actually move and walk and live and sometimes even just breathe, which sometimes feels challenging under the weight of the world's burdens. St. Francis found lightness and life and renewal in giving up his burdens to God and by patterning his life in accordance with what he heard God calling him to do. His call may not be our call, but like Francis, we can give God whatever we need to give. And then in that lighter posture, have the room to listen to where we are being called. Maybe we won't lay our clothes and our personal belongings at our parents' feet or decide to live a life of extreme poverty, but we can give up extra distraction, burden, confusion, and heaviness. We can give God that stuff that's on our hearts and weighing us down. We can name it and ask God to take it, transform it, or simply get rid of it so that we can find our true life and God's grace more fully, so that we can find peace, so that we can hear that still small voice of God, or maybe our very own voice in our lives. And maybe like Francis, we will also find or continue to find grace in the natural world around us, in the love of every living creature, even the ones that challenge us. As Joe said last week and Daniel said a few weeks ago in evening prayer, we might even find grace or gratitude for the ones that give us pain or frustration because they're real. And real things are holy despite their challenges. So come rest your souls. Like Francis, give to God whatever you cannot handle, cannot bear, or cannot understand. And let God renew and refresh you, your mind, body, and your spirit. And perhaps if we do this, we help ourselves be more whole and peaceful, and we help this St. Philip's community be the kind of community where all others can rest and find God, solace in God too. And then from that place of rest, we might find the strength to help God make this world look more like what God envisions. Because that's what St. Francis did. He turned to God, laid down his burdens in the ups and downs of his life, and he found rest. And he found that gentle yoke of God, and found meaning and purpose, and a capacity to listen, to trust, to heal, and to love. So may we follow in his footsteps, even if just a bit. May we have the courage to turn to God and have our burdens lifted, and find even more room for God's grace, peace, and strength and love in our lives. Amen.